There is a building in Princeton, New Jersey, where two men who understood the atom better than almost anyone alive would pass each other in the hallways, eat lunch within 30 feet of each other, and arrive at completely opposite conclusions about what the 20th century required of them. One of them signed petitions, wrote open letters, warned humanity, in plain language, that the weapons now in existence were capable of ending civilization, and that the only rational response was international governance, a world authority with enough power to prevent any single nation from using what physics had made possible. The other one calculated. He sat in rooms with generals. He testified before congressional committees. He ran the numbers on Soviet weapons timelines, on second strike capability, on the game theoretic structure of a standoff between two powers who each held the ability to destroy the other, and he arrived, with the same precision he applied to everything else, at conclusions that made people deeply uncomfortable. Not because they were careless, because they weren't. Both men worked at the Institute for Advanced Study. Both had seen what the physics produced. Both were operating with the full knowledge of what had happened at Hiroshima and Nagasaki and what was coming next, in the form of weapons that made those events look like a rehearsal. One of them is remembered as the conscience of modern science. The other one is remembered as eccentric, as colorful, as the man who liked fast cars and loud cocktail parties and didn't seem to take the gravity of it all seriously enough. That framing is worth examining, because the man being called eccentric was John von Neumann, and John von Neumann was not a man who failed to grasp gravity. He was a man who had done the math on it. What follows is not a defense of his conclusions. It is an attempt to reconstruct what he actually understood, as opposed to what we have found it easier to believe he understood, and to ask what that reconstruction means for the world that is still, 7 decades later, living inside the architecture he helped design. Albert Einstein understood something real and profound. It is important to say this plainly, because what comes next cannot be heard correctly if it is heard as a dismissal. Einstein understood that the bomb had changed the fundamental structure of human politics, that the existence of nuclear weapons was not simply a new development in military technology, not a more powerful version of a cannon or a bomber, but a categorical shift in what war meant. He understood that a weapon capable of destroying cities was, at scale, a weapon capable of destroying civilization. And he understood, with the clarity that sometimes comes to people who have seen their own work turned into devastation, that the political institutions of the 20th century were not equipped to manage what physics had made available. His response to this understanding was coherent and humane. He argued for world government. He signed the Russell-Einstein Manifesto in 1955, a document that called on all governments to resolve their disputes peacefully, on the grounds that a nuclear war would likely result in the end of the human species. He used his public prominence, and he was, in the 1950s, the most famous scientist in the world, to make the moral stakes as visible and as plain as possible. The argument was this: the technology has outrun the politics, and the only solution is to build political institutions capable of containing what the technology can do. It was a serious argument. It was a good faith argument. And it was the argument that history has largely validated as the correct one, the morally serious position held by a morally serious man against the various forms of realpolitik and deterrence theory that characterized the period. That is the conventional version. Here is where it starts to come apart. Einstein's argument, for all its coherence, rested on a specific assumption about the nature of the problem. The assumption was that the primary obstacle to international governance of nuclear weapons was political will, that if the major powers could be persuaded, through moral argument and public pressure, to subordinate national interest to collective survival, the mechanism for doing so could be constructed. Von Neumann did not believe this, and his reasons for not believing it were not aesthetic preferences or personality quirks. They were mathematical. By the early 1950s, von Neumann had been working on the formal structure of games, situations in which multiple actors make decisions that affect each other, where each actor is trying to optimize for their own outcome, and where the optimal strategy for each actor depends on what the other actors do. Game theory, a field he had essentially invented, and when he looked at the nuclear standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union through that framework, what he saw was not a problem that moral persuasion could solve. What he saw was a structure, two players, each capable of destroying the other, each aware that the other is capable of destroying them, each making decisions in real time about how to respond to the other's actions, knowing that the other is making the same calculation simultaneously. The question is not whether the players are moral. The question is what the structure of the game produces, regardless of the player's intentions. What the structure of that game produces, von Neumann argued, is not stability through goodwill. It produces stability only through credible threat, a threat that the other player believes will be carried out, a threat that is, in the mathematical sense, rational to execute even after the damage has been done, because if the threat is not credible, it does not deter. This is the logic of deterrence. And von Neumann was not the only person working on it, but he was one of the few people who understood both the physics of the weapons and the mathematics of the strategic situation in enough depth to see exactly how the mechanism worked, and exactly where it could fail. His conclusion was not that nuclear weapons were good. His conclusion was that international governance of the kind Einstein was proposing was not possible inside the game-theoretic structure of great power competition as it actually existed. Not because the political will was absent, because even if the will were present, the verification problem, how do you know the other side is actually disarming, reintroduced the original defection incentive at every step. The structure reasserted itself. You can disagree with this analysis. Plenty of serious people have. But it is not the analysis of a man who didn't take the stakes seriously. It is the analysis of a man who looked at the same stakes as Einstein and concluded that sentiment, however sincere, was not a load-bearing structure. The Institute for Advanced Study is worth slowing down inside for a moment. It was, in the 1950s, one of the strangest places in the world. A collection of the most formally brilliant people alive, housed in a building in the New Jersey woods, given no teaching duties, no institutional obligations, just time and proximity to each other. The idea was that genius, if left unobstructed, would find its own productive direction. What it actually produced, among other things, was a compressed version of every tension inside mid-century physics. The moral questions, the classification questions, the question of what a scientist owed to the state that funded them, and the species that would live with what they produced. J. Robert Oppenheimer was the director. He had run the Manhattan Project. He had stood at Trinity and watched the device detonate, and, by his own later account, a line from the Bhagavad Gita had come to him. I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. He had spent the years since grappling, publicly and painfully, with what that responsibility meant. In 1954, the Atomic Energy Commission revoked his security clearance. The hearing was a spectacle, a political operation dressed up as a security review, driven in large part by figures who considered Oppenheimer's post-war caution about nuclear weapons to be evidence of suspect loyalty. Von Neumann testified at those hearings. He testified in support of Oppenheimer's character. He did not recant that support. But he also did not use the moment to make the case that the hearing itself was a procedural travesty, which it plainly was. He operated, as he almost always did, inside the institutions as he found them, rather than in opposition to them. This is the detail that keeps appearing without fully resolving. At the time of those hearings, von Neumann held security clearances at a level that gave him access to assessments of Soviet nuclear capability, weapons development timelines, intelligence about the actual state of the USSR's second strike capacity. This was not information available to Einstein. It was not information available to most of the scientists who were publicly arguing for disarmament or international governance. It was not information available to Oppenheimer after the clearance was revoked. The question that sits underneath this fact is not answerable from the outside, but it should be asked. When von Neumann looked at the game-theoretic structure of the nuclear standoff and concluded that deterrence rather than disarmament was the only viable architecture, was he looking at the same situation as Einstein? Or was he looking at a different situation because he had access to different information? This is not the same question as whether he was right. Von Neumann's actual technical contributions to nuclear weapons are less discussed than his contributions to computing or game theory. This is partly because they remain, even now, partially classified. But the outline is reconstructible. His work on implosion geometry, the lens design that allowed a conventional explosive shell to compress a fissile core symmetrically enough to achieve supercriticality, was central to the plutonium bomb. Or the problem was a computational one, as much as a physical one. The shockwave propagation through different materials had to be modeled with a precision that exceeded what hand calculation could provide. Von Neumann drove the development of early computational methods specifically because he needed them to solve weapons problems. The computers he helped build at the IAS ran weapons simulations. He attended nuclear tests. He stood in the field and watched devices detonate. And he approached these events the way he approached everything, as engineering problems with parameters that could be optimized. What this reveals is not what the obituaries were reaching for when they called him colorful or unusual. What it reveals is a specific mode of cognition that von Neumann had cultivated across every domain he worked in. The ability to separate the formal structure of a problem from his feelings about its content, and to operate on the structure with complete precision while holding his feelings, if he had them, in some other compartment entirely. Whether this was a discipline or a pathology is a question the available evidence doesn't resolve. His colleagues reported that he was warm, funny, genuinely generous with his time and attention. He was not cold. He was not indifferent to people. He was apparently capable of great personal kindness. He was also capable of treating the incineration of a city as an optimization problem. And the distance between those two things, the warmth and the optimization, is not easily closed. In the early 1950s, von Neumann said on the record, in more than one forum, that a preventive strike against the Soviet Union might be mathematically preferable to waiting. The Soviets had tested their first nuclear device in 1949, earlier than American planners had expected. They were moving toward a deliverable hydrogen bomb. The window in which the United States held overwhelming nuclear superiority was closing, and von Neumann, looking at the game-theoretic structure of what came after that window closed, a world in which both superpowers held mutual second-strike capability, in which every crisis became a potential civilization-ending event, argued that there might be a case for acting before that structure fully locked in. He is sometimes quoted on this point with a phrase he may or may not have said, something about doing it on Tuesday rather than waiting. Whether the quote is accurate or not, the position is documented. He held it. He argued for it. This is the moment in his story where the standard account settles. The preventive war argument is taken as the final evidence, the place where the amorality behind the brilliance becomes impossible to ignore. Of the man who calculated so well that he forgot what he was calculating about. But here is what that reading skips over. Von Neumann's argument for preventive action was not a failure to understand the moral stakes. It was the output of a specific model, a model in which the Soviet leadership was assessed as an actor who would, once they achieved genuine second-strike capability, operate with an aggression that the mutual deterrence structure would not reliably contain. A model built, in part, on classified intelligence assessments about Soviet intentions that the people criticizing his conclusions did not have access to. The argument was wrong. In retrospect, the deterrence structure did hold, has held for 7 decades, against every prediction that it wouldn't. The Soviets did not behave the way von Neumann's model suggested they would. The equilibrium that he thought was too unstable to survive proved more durable than he calculated. But here is the uncomfortable thing. He was not wrong because his reasoning was sloppy. He was wrong because his model of Soviet intentions was wrong. And the people who were most confident that his model was wrong, who argued most forcefully that the Soviets were rational actors who could be deterred rather than aggressors who needed to be preempted, were arguing from a position of considerably less information than he had. The moral clarity on one side and the classified briefings on the other were not the same resource. And the history that vindicated the moral clarity does not retroactively mean the information was equivalent. Here is something that does not appear in most accounts of the Einstein-von Neumann contrast. Einstein's position on nuclear weapons was formed and maintained in public, using publicly available information, and argued through public channels. This is not a criticism. It is a description of how his influence worked, and it was appropriate to his role as a public intellectual with enormous moral authority. Von Neumann's position was formed inside classified programs, using intelligence that was not public, and argued through channels, congressional testimony, RAND consultations, direct communication with military and government planners that were not available to most physicists. These two men were not arguing about the same situation from different moral frameworks. They were arguing about different pictures of the situation because they had access to different pictures. The comparison that history has made, Einstein's conscience versus von Neumann's complicity, was always a comparison across an information gap that has never been fully acknowledged, because the information on von Neumann's side of the gap remains, in significant part, unavailable. This does not make von Neumann right. It makes the comparison more complicated than the standard version allows, and the standard version has been remarkably stable for 70 years. The colorful genius who liked cocktail parties and didn't feel the weight. The eccentric who ran the numbers without running the ethics. The man who understood the physics and missed the point. That framing is doing work. It is absorbing, under the category of personality, a set of arguments that might otherwise require serious engagement. It is easier to say that von Neumann was constitutionally indifferent to moral stakes than to say that he held a specific, internally coherent, information-rich position about the game-theoretic structure of nuclear deterrence that turned out to be wrong in its predictions but not obviously wrong in its reasoning. The second version requires you to argue with him. The first version just requires you to shake your head. In the spring of 1955, von Neumann was diagnosed with bone cancer. The probable cause was radiation exposure, from the weapons tests he had attended, from his proximity to the experimental work, from years of operating inside the physical reality of what he had helped build. He was 51 years old. He would be dead within 2 years. In the final months of his life, he was moved to Walter Reed Army Medical Center, and he was assigned a military escort, not of honor, not of ceremony, but of security. The concern was that as the cancer progressed and the morphine doses increased, he might, in confusion or delirium, speak classified information aloud within earshot of people who were not cleared to hear it. The man who had calculated the geometry of nuclear detonations lay in a hospital bed, dying of what those detonations had likely done to his body, with a guard stationed outside his room to contain what he might say. There is no irony in this that is not already visible. He knew what the work was. He chose to be inside it. He was not deceived about the cost. What he understood, that his proximity to the work might eventually become physical, had apparently not driven him away from it. Whether this was courage, or certainty, or something that doesn't have a clean name, is not answerable from the outside. He died on February 8, 1957. The deterrence architecture he had helped reason into existence was still standing. It is still standing now. Here is what this reconstruction leaves you with. Von Neumann understood the game-theoretic structure of nuclear deterrence with a precision that very few people, before or since, have matched. He understood that the stability of the equilibrium depended not on goodwill but on credibility. He understood that the verification problems in any disarmament scheme were not administrative inconveniences, but structural features that reintroduced the original defection incentive at every step. He understood that the window of American nuclear superiority was closing, and that the structure of the standoff after that window closed was genuinely, mathematically dangerous. He was operating with information that his critics did not have. He was reasoning from a model that his critics could not fully see, and his predictions about Soviet behavior turned out to be wrong. Not because the model was irrational, but because the model's inputs were wrong, and because the deterrence structure proved more durable than he calculated. What Einstein understood was different, that the existence of these weapons was a civilizational crisis that required a civilizational response, and that the political structures of the mid-20th century were not remotely adequate to the problem. He was right about that. The political structures were not adequate. They still aren't. What neither of them could know, what no one could know in the 1950s, and what we still don't fully know, is whether the deterrence architecture has survived because it is structurally stable, or because we have been very, very lucky. The weapons are still there. The game-theoretic logic von Neumann mapped is still operative. The equilibrium he helped design has not broken. 70 years. Dozens of crises. Several moments that, in retrospect, came closer to breaking the equilibrium than the public knew at the time. So here is the question that the script cannot close, because no one can close it. Is the fact that deterrence has held for 7 decades a vindication of von Neumann's understanding, evidence that he was right about the structure even if wrong about the timeline? Or is it simply the longest run of survivorship bias in the history of human civilization? A streak that tells us nothing about the probability of the next roll, and everything about how badly we need to believe the architecture is sound? He calculated the odds. He built the machine. The machine is still running. We don't know yet whether that means he understood something, or whether we've just been lucky enough so far not to find out that he didn't.